The old clinic stood at the edge of town, forgotten by nearly everyone except for those who passed it daily and had long stopped noticing it. Its paint had long since peeled away, leaving the walls weathered and gray, like an exhausted monument to something no one wanted to remember. The wooden boards nailed across its windows had warped over decades, leaving crooked gaps through which thin slices of daylight streamed inside. Vines crawled up the sides of the building, weaving their way into the cracks and crevices, clutching the walls like hands determined not to let go. The sign above the entrance, once a proud declaration of healing, hung crooked, one chain broken, its letters nearly illegible under years of dust and rust. Inside, the air carried a heaviness that pressed down on anyone who dared to enter. The reception area was silent, as if time had frozen the moment the doors last shut. A desk stood in the corner, its surface covered in a fine blanket of dust so thick that even the smallest footprint would have left a mark. The chairs for waiting patients were still arranged neatly, though the fabric was torn and eaten through by moths. On one chair, a child's toy, a faded wooden rattle, lay abandoned, its colors dulled but its shape unmistakable, as if the child who once held it had simply set it down and never returned. The calendar on the wall read October 1985. Its pages were stiff, curled at the edges, the numbers faded but visible, marking the final month the clinic was alive. A pen dangled from a string, still hanging beside the sign-in sheet on the counter. Names of patients were written in looping handwriting, the ink slightly smudged but legible. The last name was cut off halfway, as though someone had been writing when suddenly interrupted, never to return to finish the stroke of the pen. The hallway leading deeper into the clinic was narrow, the floor littered with scraps of paper, torn medical charts, and bottles of long-dried medicine. Cabinets lined the walls, their doors open, their contents spilled and scattered in disarray. Some held glass vials still labeled, though the liquid inside had long evaporated, leaving only crusty residue. Others contained yellowed bandages, their wrappings brittle and falling apart when touched. The smell of dust and rot was overwhelming, tinged with a faint metallic sharpness that never seemed to fade, as though the scent of antiseptic and blood had permanently seeped into the walls. Cobwebs draped across the corners like forgotten curtains, their threads catching faint particles of light that managed to slip in through cracks in the boarded windows. A broken ceiling tile lay on the floor, its jagged edges pointing upward, and just above it a water stain spread across the ceiling, the mark of countless years of neglect. The silence was suffocating, disturbed only by the occasional drip of water echoing through the empty corridors, a reminder that the building, though abandoned, was still alive in some way, decaying slowly but refusing to collapse entirely. Behind the counter in the reception area sat a stack of medical files. Their folders were brittle, their edges eaten away by time, but the writing inside remained clear enough to read. Names, addresses, symptoms, diagnoses, all recorded meticulously, as though the doctors had believed their work would continue indefinitely. Some files contained X-rays slipped between the papers, faint outlines of bones glowing softly when held up to the slanted beams of sunlight. They were patient records that had never been picked up, as if those who owned them had vanished before ever receiving their results. What was most disturbing, however, was how normal it all appeared. Nothing seemed ransacked, nothing stolen, nothing destroyed by human hands. It was as though the people who had once filled this building had simply stood up one day, walked out the door, and never looked back. The clinic remained exactly as it had been left, preserved in abandonment, each object a relic of the last day it had been alive. Even the front door groaned when pushed open, its hinges crying out after decades of disuse. The sound echoed down the empty halls, unsettling in its loneliness. To stand in that space was to feel the weight of ghosts, not the kind that appear as figures, but the ghosts of unfinished stories, of lives interrupted mid-sentence, of patients who had once trusted this place and whose records still lingered in forgotten drawers. The clinic, in its silence, whispered a question no one had answered in 40 years. Why had it been left like this, sealed away with all its secrets still inside? The explorers moved cautiously down the dim corridor, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that had gathered over decades. Every step stirred the silence, sending faint clouds into the air, particles dancing briefly in the beams of their flashlights before disappearing again into the darkness. The walls, once painted a sterile white, were now stained with streaks of brown and gray, the plaster crumbling in places to expose the bones of the building beneath. A faint draft blew through the hallway, carrying with it the smell of mildew and the cold bite of stone. At first, the rooms they passed seemed ordinary, though their contents were unsettling in their stillness. Old exam rooms stood frozen in time. The beds, covered in cracked leather, were stiff and brittle, their cushions torn open to reveal yellow stuffing. Metal trays rested beside them, still holding surgical scissors, clamps, and needles that had rusted to a dark brown. Cabinets with glass doors lined the walls, most of them ajar, their contents spilled across the floors. Medicine bottles, some still half-filled, lay shattered on the tiles, the residue hardened into dark stains. In one room, a skeleton model tilted against the wall, its joints broken, its plastic bones discolored by the years. A clipboard still hung from the foot of a bed, the notes scrawled hastily, almost illegible. A patient's name was written in black ink, followed by a list of symptoms. The final word, unexplained, seemed underlined with a shaking hand. The explorers exchanged uneasy looks but pressed forward, driven by something more than curiosity, something that felt like the need to uncover whatever had been hidden here. The deeper they moved, the darker it became. The boarded windows allowed no light to enter, and the faint glow from the front of the building seemed miles away. Their flashlights revealed peeling paint curling away from the walls like dried leaves. Shadows stretched long and crooked, bending with every movement of their lights. A faint creak echoed above them, as though something unseen still moved in the ceiling. Then they reached it, the door at the very end of the hall. Unlike the others, this one was locked tight. Its surface was heavier, reinforced with rusted metal strips, the paint blistered and bubbled as if scorched. On the wall beside it, faint letters were painted in red, "Authorized personnel only." The words were cracked and fading, but the warning remained visible, commanding silence and hesitation. The explorers tried the handle, but it did not budge. The lock was old, rusted, but still strong. For a moment, they wondered if they should leave it alone, if forcing the door open would unleash something better left buried. Yet the weight of the silence around them pushed them on. One of them produced a small crowbar from their pack, wedging it between the door and its frame. With a sharp groan, the wood cracked, and flakes of paint fell to the ground. The effort was slow, deliberate, each pull sending vibrations through the air like the building itself resented the intrusion. When the lock finally gave way, the sound echoed like a thunderclap. Dust poured from the frame, and the smell that drifted from the room beyond was heavier than the rest of the clinic, thicker, metallic, almost suffocating. The explorers hesitated at the threshold, their lights cutting into the pitch black within. What they saw made them stop breathing for a moment. The chamber was larger than the other rooms, its ceiling higher, its walls lined with machines draped in yellowing cloths. The shapes beneath the covers were bulky, unfamiliar, but unmistakably medical. Tall stands rose like skeletons, their arms reaching toward the center of the room. Tables were covered with stacks of folders, reels of film, and cardboard boxes marked with faded symbols. In the middle of the floor, a single chair stood, its straps still buckled as though waiting for someone to return. The silence here felt different, not just empty, but watchful. The explorers could almost feel the air pressing against them, as though the room itself was holding its breath. One of them stepped forward, brushing dust from the nearest machine and pulling the cloth back just enough to reveal the cold, metallic surface underneath. The flashlight beam glinted off its dials and switches, still intact despite the decades. The outline was unmistakable, it was an old X-ray machine. The group froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Why would such expensive equipment be left behind, sealed away, hidden behind a locked door? The rest of the clinic had felt abandoned, yes, but this room felt deliberately concealed, as though it had been locked to keep whatever was inside from being discovered. The explorers didn't speak. They didn't need to. The locked room had been a secret, and now they had broken it open. Whatever was waiting for them here was no accident of time, it was something that someone, long ago, had wanted to bury. The explorers stepped fully into the chamber, their flashlights trembling slightly in their hands as the beam swept across the room. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed by their movement, glinting faintly like ash in the pale light. The machines, though shrouded, loomed like silent giants, their outlines stark against the gloom. The explorers moved closer, their curiosity sharpening as their nerves warred with the heavy silence. With a deliberate tug, one of them pulled the dusty cloth from the first machine, sending a cloud into the air. Beneath the sheet stood a hulking, outdated X-ray machine. Its once polished chrome was dulled with corrosion, its buttons stiff and cracked with age. The metal arms extended rigidly, frozen in place as though caught mid-movement decades ago. The machine looked ancient, yet surprisingly intact, as though it had been sealed away before its time. One explorer reached out and pressed a button experimentally. Nothing happened, but the tactile click of the switch was startling, like the machine still remembered how to work. Against the far wall hung a lightbox. Its glass was coated in grime, but faint outlines of film strips could be seen pinned against it. One of the explorers wiped at the surface with the sleeve of his jacket, revealing the black and white glow of skeletal images. Even through the haze of dust, the shapes were unmistakable, X-rays of human bones. Long femurs, curved spines, ribs spread like cages. Some were fractured, others whole, but all were ghostly, glowing shadows of the people they once belonged to. A silence fell thicker than before as the explorers stepped closer. The films had been left hanging as if the doctor had stepped out for just a moment, intending to return, but never did. The skeletal images seemed to watch them, unblinking, eternal. One explorer, with hesitant fingers, lifted a reel of undeveloped film from a nearby tray. The strip was brittle, nearly crumbling, but the shadows etched into it were clear. Some showed common fractures, but others seemed unnatural. Shapes in the shadows that didn't resemble bones at all. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They spread the films out across a dusty table, laying them carefully beneath their flashlights to examine the details. At first glance, some seemed ordinary: broken wrists, a hip joint, a skull with a clean fracture. But then came the anomalies. One film displayed a ribcage, but inside, nestled between the bones, was a dark blotch that seemed too symmetrical, too deliberate, to be natural. Another showed a child's small skeleton, its arm twisted unnaturally, but more disturbing was the strange object lodged near the shoulder, an irregular mass with sharp angles, like metal lodged inside the flesh. The explorers whispered nervously, their voices barely audible. None of this had been catalogued, none of this had been shared. Why were these films left behind? Why were they sealed away instead of destroyed or filed away with the patient's records? One of them, braver than the rest, pulled another cloth away from a machine in the corner. It was another X-ray unit, smaller but still intact, with a tray beneath it holding more reels of film. Some were labeled with dates, all from the same year, 1985. Each bore a patient number, not a name. The explorers picked one up, holding it against the beam of their flashlight. The image that appeared sent a chill racing through them. It was a skull, but along the jawline, faint shadows suggested something unnatural, tiny shapes that almost looked like teeth, but misaligned, overlapping, more than a human should have. The explorers placed it back, their hands shaking. Another strip revealed a leg bone, with a dark silhouette wrapped around it like a second structure, an outline resembling claws. It was subtle, almost easy to dismiss as damage to the film, but the longer they stared, the harder it was to deny. These weren't ordinary medical X-rays. They were evidence of something else, something never explained. At the edge of the room sat a cabinet, its drawers half open, filled with more folders and films. Some had been bundled hastily with twine, others left loose, as if someone had been working frantically before the clinic was abandoned. The explorers opened one file and scanned the notes. The handwriting was hurried, jagged. It described growths not identifiable, unfamiliar bone density, and possible contamination. The final page ended abruptly, the ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. The group fell silent again, the only sound their uneasy breathing. The X-rays glowed faintly in their flashlights, the skeletal figures preserved in time like trapped souls. The explorers realized, with a creeping dread, that these films had not been left here by accident. They had been locked away, hidden deliberately, as though whoever had run the clinic had wanted no one else to find them. As they stood among the machines, surrounded by the ghostly remnants of patients long forgotten, one of them swore they heard a faint hum. It was so soft it could have been the trick of the ears, but it seemed to come from the machine itself, as if, after all these years, it still wanted to come alive. One of the explorers steadied his hand against the dusty wall, his breath shallow as he stared at the films glowing faintly against the lightbox. The room had shifted in atmosphere. What had begun as curiosity was now something heavier, something close to fear. The films were no longer simply medical records, they were stories, fragments of lives that had ended or transformed in ways that defied understanding. Slowly, they lifted each strip, holding them against the narrow beam of a flashlight. The more they looked, the more the anomalies became undeniable. The first few X-rays were unremarkable. A broken arm, a cracked rib, a fractured ankle, injuries common in any clinic. But then, almost without warning, the films grew strange. One image showed a chest cavity, but within it there appeared a second shape, faint but visible, curling like a spiral within the lungs. Another displayed a hand, its bones long and delicate, except for an extra finger, slightly shorter than the others, yet perfectly formed. The explorers murmured, their voices trembling, wondering why these had never been shared, why they had been left hanging as if waiting for someone to return and finish the investigation. The most disturbing films, however, were those of children. Their skeletons were small, fragile, but marked by deformities that couldn't easily be explained. One showed a child's skull, elongated unnaturally, with the teeth arranged in crooked, overlapping rows. Another revealed a spine with too many vertebrae, the curve unnatural, almost serpentine. And yet another, perhaps the most haunting, showed a child's ribcage, but inside the cage, shadowed in the negative light, was a dark shape that looked less like bone and more like a curled, living thing. The explorers exchanged uneasy glances. None dared speak the word that pressed in all their minds: inhuman. The thought hung there, unspoken but heavy, as they continued to sift through the files and films. One of them found a folder shoved hastily into the back of the cabinet. Its edges were torn, the papers inside yellowed and brittle. The handwriting in the notes was hurried, uneven, and almost illegible, as if scrawled by someone under duress. The entries described patients admitted with strange symptoms: swelling that left no trace on the skin, fevers with no cause, coughing fits that produced nothing but blood. One note read, "X-rays reveal patterns inconsistent with human physiology. Possible contamination. Still investigating." The words were underlined twice, as if the writer had wanted to be certain it was seen. Beside the folder lay a small box filled with slides. The explorers carefully held them against the flashlight beam. The images were even stranger than the X-rays. Shapes resembling tiny organisms, curled and twisting, almost like parasites captured in frozen motion. They looked wrong, too sharp-edged, too symmetrical, as though they didn't belong in the natural order. One explorer dropped a slide, the glass shattering across the floor, and the sharp sound echoed through the room like a scream. For a moment, no one moved. The silence that followed seemed almost alive. It pressed against their ears, demanding acknowledgement. And then, faintly, they began to notice something else: marks etched into the walls. Not scratches, not graffiti, but deliberate carvings. One explorer wiped away the dust and traced the outlines with a shaking finger. They were symbols, strange and uneven, as if carved in haste. Circles intersected with lines, triangles within squares, shapes that had no obvious meaning but seemed purposeful, intentional. They weren't medical, at least not in any way the explorers understood. The deeper they looked, the more the room revealed. Tucked beneath the machines were boxes filled with additional records, each marked only with a number. The dates stopped suddenly in October of 1985, every file unfinished. It was as though the clinic had been shut down in the middle of work, not properly closed, but abandoned abruptly, leaving everything behind. One of the explorers, unable to resist, pulled down a final reel of film. It was larger than the others, heavier, its surface mottled with age. When they held it against the light, the image appeared distorted, difficult to interpret. At first, it seemed to be a human skull. But the longer they stared, the more it changed. The eye sockets seemed too large, the jaw stretched too long, the teeth too sharp. One explorer swore they saw another shape overlapping it, a faint outline behind the bones, like something inside the skull itself pressing against it. They lowered the reel quickly, their hands trembling. No one spoke for a long while. The films on the wall seemed to glow brighter, as though feeding on their fear. The notes, the images, the unfinished files, they all pointed to the same conclusion: something had been happening here that could not be explained by medicine alone. Patients had come in sick, had left, or perhaps never left. The clinic hadn't been abandoned because it failed. It had been abandoned because of what it had discovered. In the corner, a metal drawer stood slightly ajar. The explorers hadn't noticed it before, but now, in the silence, it seemed to beckon them. Dust clung thickly to its handle, but etched into the front was a single word, barely visible beneath the rust: unresolved. None of them reached for it. Not yet. The X-rays already told more than they were ready to understand, and the drawer, whatever it held, promised only deeper secrets. The explorers stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the silent testimony of the machines and the ghostly glow of the films. Their nerves had been stretched thin, and though none of them wanted to admit it aloud, each could feel the same thought rising: they had seen too much already. Yet curiosity gnawed at them. The unanswered questions filled the air heavier than the dust. What had really happened here, and why had everything been abandoned without warning? The answer, they suspected, was hidden not in the machines but in the paperwork scattered carelessly, as if someone had left in a rush. One of them knelt beside a rusted filing cabinet with its drawers left half open. The metal screeched as he tugged one fully free, and inside were folders stuffed with brittle sheets of paper. He brushed the dust away carefully, opening the first record. At the top was a name, written in bold, firm handwriting, but it was the notes beneath that sent a chill down his spine. They were written in uneven script, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. Subject displayed unusual growth patterns, inconsistent with human development. Recommend further testing. Caution advised. They flipped to another page. This one described a patient who had disappeared following second imaging, though the details were vague. The word, disappeared, was underlined twice, and beside it was a hurried note, no trace. Staff instructed not to question. The explorers looked at one another, the weight of the words sinking in. These weren't just medical notes, they were warnings, perhaps confessions. As they dug deeper, the records grew stranger. One folder contained a list of patients with only numbers, no names, each followed by a single line of notes. Some read, terminated, others, transferred, and a few, perhaps the most unsettling, simply read, unresolved. A separate file tucked inside was marked with a red tab. Its pages were different from the rest, almost like a journal. The handwriting shifted from clinical observation to something frantic, emotional. The writer described strange shapes appearing in the X-rays, patients suffering from symptoms that defied medical explanation, and staff members reporting whispers in the hallways at night. The final page ended abruptly, the last line scrawled across the paper: "We are not alone in these rooms. Machines show more than bones." The explorers set the journal down, their hands trembling. The words seemed to echo in the silence, bouncing off the walls, settling into the stale air of the abandoned room. For the first time, the faint hum they had heard earlier returned, soft and low, like a machine awakening after decades of sleep. One flashlight beam shifted toward the corner where the old X-ray machine stood. The dial twitched. It was almost imperceptible, but enough to make their stomachs tighten. They backed away, unsure whether it was a trick of their eyes or something more. The hum faded, leaving the silence heavier than before. To break it, one of them opened a drawer in the desk near the wall. Inside lay a stack of personal notes, letters never sent, all in the same desperate handwriting. The final one, dated October 17, 1985, was the most haunting. It read, "The authorities are coming tomorrow. They know what we found. This place will be closed. Destroy everything. Do not leave the films. If you are reading this, it means we failed." The explorers exchanged looks filled with dread. It was no longer just a matter of curiosity. The clinic had been shut down deliberately, erased from memory, and someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that no one ever uncovered its secrets. Yet here they were, standing among the remnants that had been left behind. As they prepared to leave, one explorer glanced back at the films still glowing faintly on the lightbox. For a moment, in the shifting beam of the flashlight, the skeletal images seemed to move, as if the bones were shifting under invisible flesh. He blinked and the illusion was gone, but the chill it left remained. They retraced their steps through the corridor, the silence following them like a shadow. The calendar on the wall still read 1985, the child's toy still sat abandoned on the chair, and the dust still coated every surface like ash. But now, the clinic was no longer just an abandoned building. It was a tomb of secrets, its walls holding whispers too heavy to be carried by the living. When they stepped back into the daylight, the boarded doors closing behind them with a groan, none of them spoke. Each carried the same unspoken understanding: some places are abandoned for a reason, and some truths are buried not to be discovered but to be protected. As they walked away, the faint hum from inside the building seemed to linger in their ears, as though the machines were still running, still watching, still waiting for someone else to stumble upon the secrets left behind in 1985. Dash dash dash.